Japanese Fairy Tales, number 17, Shippei-taro. Translated by Mrs. T. H. James. Originally published by T. Hasagawa, the text of this book is in the public domain. Read for you by Number 1 Marmaduke Fan. Preface. The following story has been current in all parts of Japan from ancient times. Slightly different versions exist in different provinces, but the most widely known is the one here given. The picture of the dog on another page is a copy of one now issued from Mitsumine or Mitake-san to the faithful who reverence it as Okuchi Shinjin, the large-mouthed god, to serve as a charm to keep away devils and thieves. The original was no doubt something like the dog Shippei-taro. Should the children who read this book ever visit Japan, they might see it pasted up above the door on the outside of some house even yet. Shippei-taro. Long, long ago, in the days of fairies and giants, ogres and dragons, valiant knights and distressed damsels, in those good old days, a brave young warrior went out into the wide world in search of adventures. For some time he went on without meeting with anything out of the common, but at length, after journeying through a thick forest, he found himself one evening on a wild and lonely mountainside. No village was in sight, no cottage, not even the hut of a charcoal burner, so often to be found on the outskirts of the forest. He had been following a faint and much overgrown path, but at length even that was lost sight of. Twilight was coming on, and in vain he strove to recover the lost track. Each effort seemed only to entangle him more hopelessly in the briars and tall grasses which grew thickly on all sides. Faint and weary, he stumbled on in the fast-gathering darkness, until suddenly he came upon a little temple, deserted and half-ruined, but which still contained a shrine. Here at least was shelter from the chilly dews, and here he resolved to pass the night. Food he had none, but wrapped in his mantle and with his good sword by his side, he lay down and was soon fast asleep. Towards midnight he was awakened by a dreadful noise. At first he thought it must be a dream, but the noise continued, the whole place resounding with the most terrible shrieks and yells. The young warrior raised himself cautiously, and seizing his sword, looked through a hole in the ruined wall. He beheld a strange and awful sight. A troop of hideous cats were engaged in a wild and horrible dance, their yells meanwhile echoing through the night. Mingled with their unearthly cries, the young warrior could clearly distinguish the words, "Tell it not to Shippei-taro. Keep it close and dark. Tell it not to Shippei-taro." A beautiful, clear full moon shed its light upon this gruesome scene, which the young warrior watched with amazement and horror. Suddenly, the midnight hour being past, the phantom cats disappeared, and all was silence once more. The rest of the night passed undisturbed, and the young warrior slept soundly until morning. When he awoke, the sun was already up, and he hastened to leave the scene of last night's adventure. By the bright morning light, he presently discovered the traces of a path which the evening before had been invisible. This he followed, and found to his great joy that it led, not as he had feared, to the forest through which he had come the day before, but in the opposite direction, towards an open plain. There he saw one or two scattered cottages, and a little farther on, a village. Pressed by hunger, he was making the best of his way towards the village, when he heard the tones of a woman's voice loud in lamentation and entreaty. No sooner did these sounds of distress reach the warrior's ears than his hunger was forgotten, and he hurried on to the nearest cottage to find out what was the matter and if he could give any help. The people listened to his questions, and shaking their heads sorrowfully, told him that all help was vain. "Every year," said they, "the mountain spirit claims a victim. The time has come, and this very night he will devour our loveliest maiden. This is the cause of the wailing and lamentation." And when the young warrior, filled with wonder, inquired further, They told him that at sunset, the victim would be put into a sort of cage, carried to that very ruined temple where he had passed the night, and there left alone. In the morning she would have vanished. So it was each year, and so it would be now. There was no help for it. As he listened, the young warrior was filled with an earnest desire to deliver the maiden, and, the mention of the ruined shrine having brought back to his mind the adventure of the night before, he asked the people whether they had ever heard the name of Schippeitaro, and who and what he was. "Schippeitaro is a strong and beautiful dog," was the reply. "He belongs to the head man of our prince, who lives only a little way from here. We often see him following his master. He is a fine, brave fellow." The young knight did not stop to ask more questions, but hurried off to Schippeitaro's master and begged him to lend his dog for one night. At first the man was unwilling, but at length agreed to lend Schippeitaro on condition that he should be brought back the next day. Overjoyed, the young warrior led the dog away. Next he went to see the parents of the unhappy maiden, and told them to keep her in the house and watch her carefully until his return. He then placed the dog Schippeitaro in the cage which had been prepared for the maiden, and, with the help of some of the young men of the village, carried it to the ruined temple, and there set it down. The young men refused to stay one moment on that haunted spot, but hurried down the mountain as if the whole troop of hobgoblins had been at their heels. The young warrior, with no companion but the dog, remained to see what would happen. At midnight, when the full moon was high in the heaven and shed her light over the mountain, came the phantom cats once more. This time they had in their midst a huge black tomcat, fiercer and more terrible than all the rest, and which the young warrior had no difficulty in knowing as the frightful mountain fiend himself. No sooner did this monster catch sight of the cage than he danced and sprang round it with yells of triumph and hideous joy, followed by his companions. When he had long enough jeered at and taunted his victim, he threw open the door of the cage. But this time he met his match. The brave Schippeitaro sprang upon him, and seizing him with his teeth, held him fast, while the young warrior, with one stroke of his good sword, laid the monster dead at his feet. As for the other cats, too much astonished to fly, they stood gazing at the dead body of their leader, and were made short work of by the knight and Schippeitaro. The young warrior brought back the brave dog to his master with 1,000 thanks, told the father and mother of the maiden that their daughter was free, and the people of the village that the fiend had claimed his last victim, and would trouble them no more. "You owe all this to the brave Schippeitaro," he said as he bade them farewell, and went his way in search of fresh adventures. The End.
Japanese Fairy Tale Series, The Ogre's Arm. Told in English by Mrs. T. H. James. Originally published by T. Hasegawa in Tokyo, Japan. Read for you by #1 Marmaduke fan. The text of this book is in the public domain. The Ogre's Arm. Long, long ago, there dwelt in the mountain called Oyeyama a race of fierce ogres. The chief of these ogres was named Shutendoji, and he and his followers came down from time to time upon the city of Kyoto, causing great terror and working much mischief. Entering in at the great gate called Rashomon, they robbed and killed all that came in their way, both men and women. Now in those days, there dwelt in Kyoto a brave warrior named Minamoto no Raiko. This Raiko had 4 followers, the most daring of whom was named Suna. These followers were known far and near as Raiko's Guard. In time of war, they fought side by side, and in the intervals of peace, they lived together in Baiko's castle. It happened one dark and stormy night during one of those brief intervals that the 4 warriors were gathered round the charcoal fire, telling stories of war and adventure, and so whiling away the time as best they might. "What dull times these are," at last said Suna. "Is there no news? No hope of any fighting? I hate this quiet life." "News there is," answered another of the knights, who had just come into the room. The ogres have begun their old tricks again." "The ogres!" exclaimed the knights in awestruck and terrified voices. But Suna laughed long and loud. "Do you really believe such old wives' stories?" cried he. His companions made no reply, but shook their heads with sad and downcast looks. At last, he who had brought the news looked up and said, "Suna, since you are so sure that there are no such creatures as ogres, will you go to the Rashomon tonight and watch there alone?" "Yes," answered Suna, "I will go, and if needs be alone, although I think one of you might bear me company." But one and all protested that, though fair fight and honorable foe they feared not, yet the ogres they could not and would not face. Then up rose Suna and at once began to prepare for his expedition. "How can we be sure that you really go to the Rashomon?" asked his companions. "What sign will you give us?" "You know the notice board which stands just outside the castle gate?" replied Suna. "A new notice was posted upon it this very day. Well, if I carry the board, notice and all, and plant it down by the Rashomon where all may see it tomorrow morning, will that satisfy you, since my word of honor does not?" They all cried out that this would satisfy them, and bade him good speed. That very same night, mounting his horse and taking the notice board with him, Suna rode alone to the Rashomon, and there awaited the coming of the enemy, if enemy indeed there were. Not a soul stirred abroad or passed through the gateway, for all were in terror of the ogres. Furthermore, the night was windy and rainy, and so dark that it was impossible to see a yard before you. Undaunted, the brave warrior kept his dread and lonely watch, and yet no creature came. The night was almost over. Dawn was near. A storm had broken out afresh, when a hand, put forth from the roof of the gateway, clutched Suna's head. There above him stood an ogre of fearful aspect, his horrible head armed with a pair of copper-colored horns. With his strong and bony hand, he still grasped Suna's head and tried to lift him onto the roof. Surprised and horror-stricken, Suna was fain to confess to himself that this must indeed be Shutendoji, whose very existence he had doubted. This was no time for thought, however, and Suna at once laid hold of the ogre and tried to pull him down. Then a fierce struggle began, but Suna, being no match for the ogre in strength, would assuredly have been lifted from the ground had he not succeeded in freeing one hand from the ogre's grasp. With this hand he drew his sword and dealt one valiant blow at the ogre's arm. The arm fell, severed at the shoulder, and the ogre fled with a hideous yell. As all search for the monster was in vain, Suna at length took up the arm and returned with it to Raiko's castle. Next morning, Suna, accompanied by his friends, went to consult a famous wizard named Sei-mei as to what should be done with Shutendoji's arm. Sei-mei advised that it should be placed in a strong stone chest and watched by Suna night and day for 7 days. "But," said Sei-mei to Suna, "you must purify yourself by much fasting and prayer, and spend those 7 days in holy contemplation, holding converse with none. Unless you faithfully carry out my directions, I foresee that misfortune will surely follow." Suna therefore caused a strong stone chest to be prepared, placed the ogre's arm within it, and, having purified himself by fasting and prayer, sat down alone to watch it. The doors were shut, and all visitors refused admittance. Alone and wrapped in holy contemplation, Suna kept watch and ward. One night, when the 7 days and nights were almost accomplished, came a knocking at the gate. "Who is there?" cried out Suna. "It is your old aunt from the country," answered a cracked and feeble voice. "Pray open the door," Suna answered. "I am under a vow to hold converse with none until 7 days be past. I cannot open the door even to my aunt." "I know that," returned the voice, "but I have come a long way on purpose to see you. I am footsore and weary. Surely you will not turn me away?" Suna still refused for some time, but at last he allowed himself to be persuaded to open the door. "I have heard of your noble exploit," said the old woman as she came in. and I have come all this long way to tell you how proud I am of my brave nephew." "And where is the ogre's arm now?" she continued, when Suna had thanked her for her kindness in coming to see him. "The arm is in this stone case," said he. "Is it indeed now? Well, would you believe it? Although I have lived all these years, yet I have never in my life seen such a thing. Let me pray have one little peep at it." "I am very sorry," said Suna, "but my vow forbids my opening the case, or showing the arm to anyone, even for a moment, until the 7 days are past." At this the old woman burst into bitter tears, refusing to be comforted. Thereupon Suna, who was a soft-hearted young warrior, could withstand her no longer. "Just one look, then," said he, and lifted the lid of the chest. The pretended aunt took up the arm and seemed to be gazing at it in a kind of rapture, when suddenly appearing in her true shape, which was none other than that of the ogre Shutendoji, she shouted, "My arm is my own again!" and immediately vanished through a hole in the roof. Suna, quickly recovering from his surprise, rushed out, but not a trace of the ogre was to be found. Sad and crestfallen, the warrior bent his steps to the house of Raiko and told him all that had happened. Raiko called his followers round him, and they there and then solemnly vowed that they would one day destroy the ogres in their stronghold of Oyeyama, or perish in the attempt. The end. If you enjoyed this story, check out the playlist of fairy tales linked in the description below. If you like these stories, you can support my channel by liking this video, commenting with your thoughts, subscribing, clicking the bell to receive notifications, and you can also support me on the platform Subscribestar. Thanks to my subscribers, my super chat donators, and to you for listening. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later. Japanese Fairy Tales: The Ogres of Oyeyama. Published by Takajiro Hasegawa. Translated by T.H. James. The text of this book is in the public domain. Read by #1 Marmaduke fan. The Ogres of Oyeyama. The great warrior, Raiko, had received orders from the Mikado to punish the ogres who lived in Oyeyama and to rescue from their clutches the captives they had seized and carried off to their stronghold. For in those days there was hardly a family in Kyoto which had not to mourn the loss of one or more of its members. No one as yet had courage to make an attack upon the ogre's castle. Watanabe Suna, one of Raiko's followers, had indeed lain in wait for Shutendoji, the chief of the ogres, at the gate called Rashomon in Kyoto. There a famous struggle had taken place, in which, though the ogre escaped him, Suna had cut off and carried away in triumph the monster's arm. Shutendoji, however, by means of a clever trick, got back his arm again, and he and his horrible crew from this time forward became bolder and bolder, until at last the whole city was filled with terror and mourning. Raiko was delighted to receive the Mikado's order. Indeed, this was all he had been waiting for, as he and his band had long vowed the destruction of the ogres. Raiko then, with Suna and his other followers, prepared for their journey. Well armed and with their good swords in their belts, this brave little band, consisting of but 5 warriors, set off towards the mountain still known as the Ogre's Hill, at the top of which they expected to find the monster's den. But the path was rough, if not indeed actually dangerous, and often they lost traces of it altogether, while the thick trees prevented their seeing any distance before them. At length their difficulties increased so much that they were at a loss which way to turn, when there suddenly appeared in front of them an old man of mild and venerable aspect. His long and snow-white beard flowed down over his rich garment, while his countenance sheamed with heavenly radiance like a bright spring morning. Raiko bowed low, and addressing himself to the old man, asked him if they were in the right way to the ogre's mountain. "What would you seek there, my son?" demanded the old man in his turn. Then Raiko took out a little bag of rich gold brocade, and from it drew the Mikado's order, clearly written in large letters, "I command you, Raiko, to punish the ogres." When the old man had read the order, he spoke thus to Raiko: "My son, only in one way can you hope to fulfill this command. Your swords are powerless against these monsters, and if you trust to them alone, you will soon be dead men. Shutendoji, as his name truly signifies, only lives to eat and above all to drink. Through his love of wine shall you overcome him. Follow me." So saying, the old man led the warriors to his dwelling on the hillside, and after he had set food before them and they had refreshed themselves, he brought out these gifts. For Raiko, a helmet which was proof against every weapon, a magic sword, and a drinking flagon or goblet. This flagon had 2 mouths, and was so cunningly contrived that, though to outward appearance it was as one vessel, yet by means of a secret division it could be made to contain 2 separate and distinct liquors. Besides, he disguised the warriors in the garments of Yamabushi, or mountain hermits, the flowing robes quite concealing the armor and weapons which they all wore beneath. Added to this, the old man gave to Raiko some of the famous wine of Sakai, and a small white powder, which was in truth a most powerful sleeping drug. Then he gave them full directions as to the path they should follow, and also as to their behavior when they should have gained admittance into the ogre's castle. "Go, my sons, and may heaven prosper you," said the old man as they bade him a grateful farewell. Thus equipped and filled with new courage, the little band set out once more. As they journeyed, they talked to each other of the kindness and wisdom of the old man from whom they had just parted, and as they talked, a sudden light seemed to burst upon them, and they with one voice exclaimed, "This was no mere mortal, the gods themselves have come to our help." So saying, they turned round and bowed their faces to the ground, worshipping. Over mountain and through glen they took their way, fording the streams, for bridges there were none, and climbing steep precipices, aided often by the rope-like stems of the wild wistaria. After a hard day's march, they came, towards evening, to the foot of a thickly wooded hill. There they met with a beautiful maiden, engaged in washing blood-stained garments in the mountain torrent, which here flowed more quietly through the valley. The warriors, in surprise, asked her what she did alone in this desolate spot. "Alas, sirs," she answered, "I am a captive, and am obliged to do the bidding of my masters, the ogres. Fly, I beseech you, while there is yet time, from this haunted spot." "No, indeed," said Raiko. "We have come on purpose to find the ogre's den. Before morning you shall be free." So leaving the maid in astonishment, they began to climb the mountain. They had not gone far when they met a young ogre, who was cook to Shutendoji. What was the horror of the warriors to find that he was carrying home part of a human body, which he meant to cook for the ogre's supper. Indeed, all around lay human bones, bleaching in the sun, which had been flung down the precipice from the ogre's kitchen. Hiding his disgust as well as he could, Raiko bade the ogre good evening, and asked him politely if he and his friends could find shelter for the night in his master's castle. "We are poor mountain priests," said Raiko, "traveling to Kyoto, and have lost our way. As it is now near sunset, and we are both faint and weary, we hope your master will not send us away." The young ogre readily agreed to state their case to Shutendoji, thinking all the time to himself, "What a fine feast we shall have off these fat old priests." And now they came in sight of the castle. Dark and gloomy it looked, among tall pine trees and giant rocks of weird and curious shape. The demon cook begged the pretended priest to wait at the gate while he learned his master's pleasure concerning them, but soon returning, led them into the presence of Shutendoji himself. The monster was seated at the upper end of a long hall. Around him were soft cushions and silken curtains, and scattered about lay drinking cups and bottles. But who can describe the horrible aspect of the ogre as he reclined on a golden armrest, with his red body, hideous features, and copper-colored horns? He was enough to strike terror into the boldest heart. Shutendoji, however, received the pretended priests with much condescension, and invited them to sup and spend the evening with him. The supper was soon brought in by attendant ogres, and consisted mainly of animals' heads and human bones, though there was also a dish or two of wild boar and other game. Raiko and his comrades were almost sick with the sight, yet dared not refuse to partake of this ghastly feast. The ogre and his lords were too busy with their own meal, which they devoured ravenously, to notice that their guests did no more than feign to eat, and in reality left the disgusting morsels untasted. All this time, wine had been flowing like water. Indeed, there was a large tub of it standing near, from which smaller vessels were constantly being filled. Some of these vessels, frightened to tell, were human skulls, and were handed to the ogres by captive maidens, whom they forced to wait upon them. When Raiko saw that Shutendoji had drunk a great deal, and that the fun was becoming fast and furious, he thought that now was his time to act. So stepping forward, he offered to show them the Kyoto dance, for which he was famous. He danced so well and handled his fan with so much grace that the drunken ogres screamed with delight, making the hall echo again to their shouts. Then, producing the double drinking stoup, Raiko offered it to Shutendoji, assuring him that it contained some of the finest Sakai wine. Raiko had before this taken an opportunity of filling both compartments of the stoup with wine, but into one of them he had cunningly dropped the white powder. This side of the flagon he took care should always be presented to the ogre and his lords, while he and his followers as carefully drank out of the other. Shutendoji loudly praised the wine, and was not content until he had drained the last drop. Though he had allowed the other ogres to have a sip, yet he had drunk the lion's share himself, so that he was soon asleep, and snoring like the sound of distant thunder, and before long most of his retainers had followed his example. Then up rose Raiko, and gave the signal to his comrades. Drawing their swords, they soon made short work of the sleeping ogres, while Raiko came near to Shutendoji, wielding the magic sword, the gift of the gods. As he raised his hands to strike, the blade lengthened of its own accord, and with one blow the monster's head was severed from his body. In a moment the hideous head flew up into the air, the mouth opening and shutting, the teeth grinding, the eyes rolling, and the horns springing out to an appalling length. 7 times it whirled round, and then made a dash at Raiko's head. And it would have fared badly with the hero, but for the armor by which he was protected. The demon's teeth bit through the hat, but were powerless against the helmet. The head fell at length to the ground with a heavy thud, and the victory was won. After they had slain the ogres, Raiko and his brave comrades released the captives, divided the spoil, and finally set fire to the castle, destroying at once and forever that abode of wickedness. Then the brave warriors, followed by the rejoicing band of released captives, gladly took their way home, bearing the head of Shutendoji with them. But before leaving the ogre's hill, they reverently buried the bones of former victims and set up a stone to mark the spot. Raiko received honors and rewards from the Mikado and the everlasting gratitude of the citizens of Kyoto, whom he had thus delivered from the raids of the ogres. The end. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, I think you'd love all of the fairy tales in my playlist of fairy tales from around the world. You can support this channel by liking this video, commenting with your thoughts, subscribing, and clicking the bell to receive notifications of future videos, and you can support this channel on Subscribestar. Thanks to all my Subscribestar supporters, and thank you to my Super Chat donators. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later. While the thick Raiko had before this taken up Japanese Fairy Tales, The Enchanted Waterfall by Kate James. Read by #1 Marmaduke fan. This book is in the public domain. Once upon a time, there lived alone with his father and mother a simple young woodcutter. He worked hard all day on the lonely hillside or among the shady trees of the forest. But, work as hard as he might, he was still very poor, and could bring home but little money to his old father and mother. This grieved him very much, for he was an affectionate and dutiful son. For himself he had but few wants, and was easily pleased. His mother, too, was always cheerful and contented. The old father, however, was of a selfish disposition, and often grumbled at the poor supper of rice, washed down with weak tea, or, if times were very bad, with a cup of hot water. "If we had but a little sake now," he would say, It would warm one up and do one's heart good. And then he would reproach the simple young fellow, vowing that in his young days he had always been able to afford a cup of sake for himself and his friends. Grieved at heart, the young man would work harder than ever, and think to himself, "How shall I earn some more money? How shall I get a little sake for my poor old father, who really needs it in his weakness and old age?" He was thinking in this way to himself one day as he was at work on the wooded hills, when the sound of rushing water caught his ear. He had often worked in the same spot before, and could not remember that there was any torrent or waterfall near. So, feeling rather surprised, he followed the sound, which got louder and louder, until at last he came upon a beautiful little cascade. The water looked so clear and cool that he stooped down where it was flowing away in a quiet stream, and using his hand as a cup, drank a little of it. What was his amazement to find that instead of water, it was the most excellent sake! Overjoyed at this discovery, he quickly filled the gourd which was hanging at his girdle, and made the best of his way home, rejoicing that now at last he had something good to bring back to his poor old father. The old man was so delighted with the sake that he drank cup after cup. A neighbor happening to drop in, the story was told to him, and a cup of sake offered and drunk with many words of astonishment and gratitude. Soon the news spread through the village, and before night there was hardly a man in the place who had not paid his visit of curiosity, been told the tale of the magic fountain, and smelt the gourd, which, alas, was now empty. Next morning the young woodcutter set off to work even earlier than usual, not forgetting to carry with him a large gourd, for of course the enchanted waterfall was to be visited again. What was the surprise of the young man when he came to the spot, to find several of his neighbors already there, and all armed with buckets, jars, pitchers, anything that would carry a good supply of the coveted sake. Each man had come secretly, believing that he alone had found his way to the magic waterfall. The young woodcutter was amused to see the looks of disappointment and anger upon the faces of those who already stood near the water, as they saw fresh arrivals every moment. Each one looked abashed and uncomfortable in the presence of his neighbors, but at last one bolder than the others broke the grim silence with a laugh, which soon the others were fain to join in. "Here we are," said he, "all bent on the same errand. Let us fill our jars and gourds and go home. But first, just one taste of the magic sake." He stooped down, and filling his gourd, put it to his lips. Once and yet again did he drink with a face of astonishment, which soon gave place to anger. "Water!" he shouted in a rage. "Nothing but cold water! We have been tricked and deceived by a parcel of made-up stories. Where is that young fellow? Let us duck him in this fine waterfall." But the young man had been wise enough to slip behind a big rock when he saw the turn things were taking, and was nowhere to be found. First one and then another tasted of the stream. It was but too true. No sake, but clear, cold water was there. Crestfallen and out of temper, the covetous band returned to their homes. When they were fairly gone, the good young woodcutter crept from his hiding place. "Could this be true?" he thought, "or was it all a dream? At any rate," said he, "I must taste once more for myself." He filled the gourd and drank. Sure enough, there was the same fine-flavored sake he had tasted yesterday. And so it remained. To the good dutiful son, the cascade flowed with the finest sake, while to all others it yielded only cold water. The emperor, hearing this wonderful story, sent for the good young woodcutter, rewarded him for his kindness to his father, and even changed the name of the year in his honor, as an encouragement to children in all future time to honor and obey their parents. The end. Thank you for listening. If you'd like to hear more stories like this one, check out the playlist for all my fairy tales linked in the description below. If you'd like to support this channel and help me make more audiobooks, please like this video, comment with your thoughts, subscribe, and click the bell to be notified of future videos in this series. You can also support this channel on Subscribestar, where I share public domain photography and more. Thank you to my Subscribestar supporters, thank you to my Super Chat donators, and thanks to you for listening. I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys, and I'll catch you later.